What's up, everybody? Corey Hughes, Bloody History. Today it's probably gonna be a shorter show, but we're gonna wrap up the Phil Boatwright interview with Harold Weisberg. So let's just pick it up from where we left off. He's talking about Barbara Reed and a couple people in New Orleans. Let me see. I'll pick it up here. Her husband was a pilot, I believe Barbara said. Oh, yes. But that's been many, many years ago. How old are they? Well, she's maybe 40 to 45. She was living alone when I knew her. I mean, when we knew her in New Orleans. She spoke of having had a husband, whether or not there was a divorce or whether they simply parted. You never knew her husband? No, I didn't. I guess it was Barbara who told me her husband had been a pilot. He may have been. I think Mim was a pilot, an aviatrix herself. How would one find her? It's like everything else in the quarter. Everybody talks, you know. Where did she live then, do you know? Yes, she lived on... Wait a minute. And while you're looking... Yes, apartment 202, 638 Royal. Does Thornley know her? Oh, sure. She made her living by sidewalk drawings and paintings. Yes, Jackson Square, right? Anywhere, Dixieland Hall, Jackson Square. They're on the corner of, looks like it was Redacted, and St. Peter's. Did you spend much time in Dixieland Hall? I was there once. Did you ever know Al Clark, who runs it? Al Clark? Clark, he runs it. Preservation Hall I went to, on St. Peter Street. Yes, now does Thompson, Scott, or Patterson, to your knowledge, know Thornley? Oh, yes. How intimately, I don't know. But you know that they knew each other. Oh, sure. If you think of anybody else, now or after I leave, interrupt me now or drop me a note, will you, of people who knew Thornley. I want to check every bit of it down to the ground, including if it's all opposed to what I believe. I want to check it all down. In this little community in the quarter, and it amounts to that, everybody knows everybody by name, and they don't know very much more than that. Barbara mentioned Frederick and Alice. Alice is... Frederick, first of all, is her former husband. Barbara's former husband? Alice is Frederick's mother. I don't know what that is. Those names fit. I don't know if she has something else in mind. I remember now the connection in which she mentioned it. Frederick, I think, does a house organ for an oil company. Yes, lives in New York City. Was he in the quarter then? No. Then that is irrelevant. It has no relationship. Now, there was a movie being made with gays, she thinks you may remember something about. There was a lawyer with it. Was it outside Carlos Castillo's? A movie. A motion picture. Oh, yes. Toys in the Attic was made there. That's the name. Yes, Brandy and I, Barbara and I worked as extras. Yes, now there was a lawyer who seemed to run the thing. A lawyer? She thought he was a lawyer. A rather well-dressed man, who she thought was a lawyer, who seemed to have been involved with this. No, he was connected with something else, but she seemed to think he had got himself in as an extra too. She seemed to think that he was getting carried away with the emotion of it and sort of let it be known that he was without so having done earlier. None of that has any, doesn't ring a bell? Do you know if Thornley was connected with it at all? You mean at work there? As an extra or in any way? No, I don't believe so. I don't think he was. Do you remember about a theater group that was started by a man who I believe, and I think it was this lawyer, a man who absconded with the dough? Yes, I don't know the man's name. I guess I did know it at the time, but I don't recall his name. I never did meet him. Brandy was interviewed by him, I believe, for a part, and the production was to be presented. The next production, which happened to be Faulkner's Requiem for a Nun. The play was not being produced at that time. The theater was closed, but on the marquee was an announcement. I believe the theater was over on Royal Street. I'm not sure about that. Possibly it was closer to the river. Do you know if Thornley had any connection with that? No, I don't believe he did. I couldn't... Do you know anything about the man who was organizing it? The production? Yes, or the whole theater group. No, only that Brandy was interviewed by him. and it was a distasteful experience for her. To be interviewed by him? Yes, but I wasn't present. She didn't get the part. Well, she didn't give me any details. Only she started to talk about it, and we got off on something else, and I don't now recall what relevance she thought it had. This was relatively soon after we arrived in New Orleans because we were living on Royal Street at the time. Now about Carlos Castillo, in which I have some interest. Carlos and his restaurant, you mean? Yes, a very unprofessional business. This is his card, Hugh. His Mexican restaurant, 620 Conte. Well, from other people, I understand that every once in a while he would close the restaurant and engage in political discussions with people when they came from Cuba and a thing like that. Does any of that sound familiar? No. Do you remember anything about his renting space upstairs to use by other people? Probably Barbara mentioned this to you. She asked me if I knew of anyone living upstairs. Don't know, I don't recall. Do you remember any of the waitresses? Yes, there was one. Wait a minute. This girl was very, very close to Thornley. Yes, what was her name? She liked him very much, and he had a tendency to treat her well, an object of convenience. A utensil? That, at least as I understood it, would be the situation, by and large, but I cannot for the life of me recall her name. I didn't know her well, I just knew her to. Do you remember what she looked like? Well, she was a dark-complexioned woman, Latin, I guess. Rather good-looking? Yes, she was. Dark hair. Better educated than you might expect a waitress to be? I would say that she had a greater sensibility and probably greater intelligence. Whether or not she had any formal education, I couldn't tell you. Barbara seems to have had something like this in mind, but she was unclear, and she told me to take it up with you. I don't have any, and it's from her, Barbara's impressions, is that this girl was better educated than most waitresses. She can't, oh yes, that was the impression one got. Whether or not this involved formal education, I can't say. Well, was this waitress close to Castillo, do you know? You mean in a personal sense? Not was she his girlfriend, but did they seem to get along pretty well? Did she pretty well know what was going on, if anything? They got along, I guess. How would I find her? Have you any suggestions as to how I might? Is Castillo still in the business? I've never taken the time to go there and find out. I've been intending to since November. He might, on the other hand, he might not. He's extremely on that. I'm interested in him, so I don't think I should ask him how to find her. And I'll tell you why I'm interested in him. I said I'd tell you in a moment why I'm interested in him. You were about to say something. Well, the only person I could suggest would be Thornley himself. He, of course, would know, but how close was he to Carlos, do you know? Thornley? Yes, he regarded Carlos as a character, is all, so as far as I know. Carlos was very volatile, arrogant at times, very abusive fellow, and sometimes a very nice guy. Almost the same. Ever hear him talk politics? No. Ever hear him talk about smuggling? No. Taking washers and refrigerators and things like that to Cuba and presumably guns? No. Never heard any talk about gun running? No, I didn't. These are things I've heard about of Carlos. Who else did you see Thornley with at Carlos's, if you do remember? He used to come in to see this girl, but he didn't come there with other people. Not to my knowledge, he was a loner. But Barbara gave me the impression that he more or less hung around with you. Yes, he did. He would go out with you, just know where to bump into you, and then disappear for a couple hours and come back. She seemed to remember his having fairly regular meetings with one particular guy about once a week. The only person that I know of that Carrie had a lot to do with was this fellow I mentioned earlier, Vic Latham. Yes, no, not Layton. This was a man who I think was in some way somehow connected with one of the Cuban groups. But I'm not sure. Barbara was never with him when he was with this man. She just knows of his having met with a person. This is consistent with something else I picked up, and that's why I'm wondering if you can remember anything of that sort. No, but I'll try, just like this postcard. I didn't remember it initially, and Barbara told me when you spoke to her the second time, you told her about it. She told me when Yes, I remembered receiving it. Did you ever know a Will Cuthbert Brady, a homosexual who writes? Brady? Brady, Will Cuthbert Brady. A Joe Moore, a Jose Moreno, Jose Moore. A Joe Deering, Edward Scannell Butler. Did you ever know him? He's somebody whose name McAuliffe could have mentioned because I think at the time they were connected. Butler was the vice president, the executive vice president, I think, of the Information Council of the Americas. Did McAuliffe ever mention any of these names? Apparently there was a negative answer following each of the names in the foregoing. That's in parentheses, so it's not on the tape. His answer is no. Did you ever hear the name Edgar Eugene Bradley? Bradley's not an uncommon name. How about a name Morris Brownlee? He was David Ferry's, and then it looks like a word is redacted, in-law. David Ferry had an in-law? Morris Brownlee was David Ferry's in-law? Hang on a fucking second. Morris Brownlee, whose name definitely comes up as an alias in certain times, tells me that he's on the outskirts, not really a big fucking deal in this thing, because anybody's name is getting used as an alias is definitely not involved, right? So, but Morris Brownlee, it's saying here he was David Ferry's blank in-law. That requires immediate research, okay, to my guys in the research chat. Now, I think he's only on pills. When he gets excited, he kind of bounces on his knees like an orange orangutan, a very intelligent young man, thin and dark. Ever meet anybody of that description? No. Did you know any of the Mexican reporters who visited town when you were there? No. Now, besides La Marina, what other places could you have gone to with Barbara? Holy mackerel, well, a lot of places. I asked you about Havana. Did I ask you if you ever went to Peña's Havana Bar? Yes. I think that's the Havana Bar. Yes, you asked me about that. To my knowledge, we were never in there. Remember, the Havana Bar is where Oswald is seen with a husky Latin with the pockmarked face, and he's got the clip-on bow tie, right? And he's throwing up and fucking got his arms slung over his husky Latino friend's face. Obviously, William C. Moore and Lawrence Howard, right? But it was being run by this guy, Peña. What the fuck was Peña's first name? Oros Peña. So Oros Peña, when he gets fucking deposed, he's a funny guy. He clearly working with CIA, clearly bouncing around to other countries. And here Weisberg is implying that he's a fucking gun runner. So that makes sense to me. That definitely makes sense to me. But it's just, to me, it's so funny because of this intimate circle, right? So you got Howard, Hall, and Seymour definitely connected at Peña's bar, the Havana Bar. They're seen there. And then he's an alleged CIA gun runner. The irony just kills me. I asked you about the Havana Bar. Did I ever ask you if you ever went to Peña's Havana Bar? Yes. You asked me about that. To my knowledge, we were never in there. That's Barbara's recollection, but I must have written down the wrong thing when she called me a year and a half ago. How about the galley? Oh, the gallery. Is it the gallery? The Unicorn Gallery or something. There were paintings. No, there's a bar called that kind, the Open Galley, the Old Galley. It has no sign out. I don't recall that. How about Lafitte's? I don't believe I was ever in Lafitte's. I know where it is. Cosimo? Oh, yes. I was in there once myself. Only once? Yes, once. That's a homosexual bar. That's correct. And I was made very uncomfortable by the atmosphere. I went in and had a drink. Yes, there's a place called Mom's Society. Have you ever been there? No, not to my knowledge. Mom's quite a character. Oh, that place is crowded with characters, the French Quarter. Let me ask you about a few more people I made some notes of. Did you ever hear of a guy named Jim Poole? A guy called Tiger Joe. One called Bulldog. How about Guy Bannister? He had a detective agency. Did you ever walk with Thornley in the general neighborhood of Lafayette Square? That's outside the quarter, isn't it? Yes, but not far. To my knowledge, Carrie and I were never together outside the French Quarter. Yes. Bill Dalzell. No. McAuliffe could have mentioned his name. He was one of the organizers of that group that McAuliffe got interested in. He was a man with a remarkable facility in languages. He could speak an almost limitless number as a native. Whatever language he spoke, he had a proper accent for it. Ooh, that sounds exciting. And he, for a while, lived with Betty Tarrant. Or maybe Parrott. Do you know Betty Parrott? No. How about Manuel Gill, spelled G-I-L? No. Frank Bartz. Really, Bartz, B-A-R-T-E-S. No. Sergio Arcacha Smith. He ran down the Cuban Revolutionary Council for a while. No. Another one who succeeded him is who ran a different group at that same time, a little bit later, Rudolph Richard Davis, a.k.a. Ricardo Davis. Did I ask you before if you ever knew a Carlos Bernier? I think I did. He has a store on Decatur Street. Oh, you did mention the print shop. Next to the, in front of the print shop and next to it, yes. No, I don't believe I ever saw him. He's the New Orleans, he ran the Cuban Student Directorate in New Orleans, the same group that Courtney had the connection with. Well, that's interesting, because Kent never implied that there was an organization or plans for this organization in New Orleans. And then it says, in parentheses, I thought this something from the Cuban student group in Miami. If you want to be more fascinated, it is he who went out and picked this fight with Oswald and that got Oswald arrested. And I think that what Oswald did makes sense only as part of the establishment of intelligence cover, because he then took the publicity and went down to Mexico to the Cuban consulate and said, see what kind of good comrade I am. So how about giving me a visa? So my interest in, was Courtney the one who complained against the... No, Courtney had no complaint, but Bernier. Oh, I see. Bernier was the man who precipitated this ruckus with Oswald. Oswald appeared at his place of business right before that to offer to train commandos. Remember, it's my opinion that the man who met with Bernier, who was obviously knowingly in on this with Thornley, met with Thornley. And it was Thornley who offered to train the commandos, but that was a whole staged incident. The whole thing is set up. I see. Did you ever know a girl named Ruthie in the quarter whose father, she'd be a very young girl, whose father was a prominent lawyer? Did you ever bump into Dean Andrews? You know who he is. He's a short, roly-poly lawyer with a tremendous love for jazz. And he blows a pretty hot clarinet himself. Dean Andrews must have been a fucking blast to hang out with. No, I don't recall. Dean Adams Andrews. He was one of the few lawyers who would take the cases of homosexuals. I don't place the name. Speaking of homosexuals, you know one who was kind of mature and responsible and in the quarter who I might talk to. And who I might expect fairly straight answers from. I'll tell you frankly why. I want to cap the information I have, and they, of course, have quite a self-defense problem, and they're afraid of fuzz generally. Garrison is the last district attorney they want to be afraid of. But aside from that, not only do they know things, but in addition to that, I want some kind of good connection with them so that when the Oswald part of the frame-up falls apart, they won't be the next set of goats. Because the two most likely goats are homosexuals per se and Cubans per se. You mean for the assassination? Yes, and they may be unwilling to believe that, but believe me, it is so. No, sir, I don't have anybody. Did you ever know Carlos Quiroga? A young man. We were talking about artists when we were having a bite to eat. Yes, it doesn't answer the question about Carlos Quiroga, by the way. Yes, about Dick Hoffman. Dick Hoffman, do you know Dick from after his marriage to Patricia? Or did you know Patricia? Long, blonde? No, the girl that he was associated with when you first knew him. They were not married in the legal sense, but they were friends. Yes, I don't know. I knew of his association with no other woman. Can you tell me something about the woman whom you knew him with? The type who did some typing. I'll tell you what I'm driving at. We were having lunch and he talked about her having typed the manuscript of a book for Martin McAuliffe. He's talking about Joyce Talley, by the way. She did some typing for Martin, mostly out of kindness by Martin. She was not an especially good typist, but she found difficulty supporting herself, making kind of... And Martin, I don't know how Martin had met her, but he'd let her do some typing for him and what it amounted to in order to pay her something. I was trying to think of the name of that book now, but I've forgotten. I don't know if it was ever published or not. And in the handwritten notes, it says the book was at this time titled The Saints, but I've never even something read it. Do you remember the subject? I think it was a book about New Orleans, sort of. No, I don't know. There's something we didn't talk about. Do you know Ray Berg? For a short period of time, he was a book publisher, and he had a manuscript someone else thought I should read, The Day the Eagle Died, a book about Cuba. No, I don't recall the name or the title. Are you suggesting Mim was outside, either working or selling the paintings? That's what she used to do, yes. She, who were her closer friends, whom I might go looking for? I think anybody in the quarter who was there now, who was there then, Larry, what's his name, runs Preservation Hall. I don't know his name, but I know who you mean. He could tell you where she is if she's still in the quarter. Bernstein or Bornstein or something like that. He runs Preservation Hall there on St. Peter Street. There's a galley called Starving Artists, Inc. on St. Peter and Bourbon. Anybody there could tell you where she lives if she's still in the quarter. Did you ever know a John Dote, D-O-D-T? He threw kind of fancy parties. Or Ivan Kopman, also an artist. Or Bootsy Gay. She was a gay. She had a gallery of some sort, came from a good Southern family. Do you remember the names of the gallery? No, I'm sorry to say I don't. No, I don't think the name is not familiar. I don't. Hoffman used to hang around the Unicorn Gallery, which is next to the Bourbon House. Did you ever know Roger Lovin? No. Did you ever know Walter Kraft? No. I'm trying to think of another name that you might know. I can't. The name is gone from my mind. Did you ever spend much time with... It's illegible. No, but I know where it was. Let's see. I either applied or was going to apply for a job as a waiter. The only time I was ever in there for any length of time was when I had dinner in there once. We went to the Court of Two Sisters to eat when we were working as extras. They treated you? Oh, yes, the company, yes. Did you ever see Thornley there? No. At the Court of Two Sisters, it was really of no interest to me. That's a kind of touristy. We ate at there's a Chinese place on Bourbon Street called, I don't know what it's called. We would eat there or at the Bourbon House occasionally, but their food is pretty wretched. There was occasionally after we left the Cascade Los Marinas, we'd go next door. There's a Chinese place next door down there. Pretty rough spot. Did you see many Cubans at Los Casas? There were many Latins. I don't know if they were Cubans or not. I meant Latins. Oh, yes, of course. It was a Latin spot. One guy whose name I did know and have forgotten spoke to me for some reason, struck up a conversation. He was a Guatemalan who told me that about the political conditions had made it advisable that he leave, but you know how political things change daily, so I don't know what he meant by that. Were homosexuals prominently at Los Casas? No more so than I imagine. Then, as I recollect, then in the quarter, they were quite predominant. For the most part, they're inoffensive individuals if left alone. There is a group, a certain type, is quite belligerent. As they are genuine homosexuals, or are they latent homosexuals, if you know the distinction? Some would dress frequently in drag, as they say. That I take to be overt homosexuality. That is a transvestite. Well, I don't mean that it wasn't overt, but I mean they were, in the common phrase, bisexual. Oh, well, that I don't know. I think these are ones most prone toward violence. I remember when I first went to New Orleans that not the Times-Picayune, but the other paper, the States Item, yes, used to, that's more tabloid types. They used to run headlines about vice raids, etc. I had first got the impression that all homosexuals were kind of oppressed in New Orleans, and I was kind of saddened by it. But then I discovered that there were this, if it was this ilk that was engaged in pretty brutal affairs, they were the ones who were being, but that's about all I know. But of course, about every third person in the French Quarter is of questionable sex, or at least that would be my impression. Both sexes? Yes, it was hard to tell, but again, I didn't. I'll have to say that Brandy and I spent an enormous amount of time. In fact, most of our time there, we were alone together. We did not mix as much as she might have, especially since she is more of an extrovert than I am. Circumstances had been different. We probably would have known more people, gotten out more. As it is, we did not. So I knew people only superficially, and that was all right with me. Since we first started to talk, have you thought of any of the things that we went over earlier in more detail? Has anything come to your mind that escaped it when we first started talking? No, I do hope that I find the letters. That I do too, especially that letter from Thornley. And I wish there was. I'll go over everything very closely in an effort to find them. But the life in the quarter, I knew a great many people superficially, because the quarter is a community in which many people know many other people without knowing them in depth. Patterson used to talk about the hardcore, the people who really were in positions of trust, so to speak, in the quarter. He says it takes a long time to get in with the in-group. Well, I wasn't in New Orleans very long, and I didn't really court this community. I mean, I wasn't interested in it too well. You spoke about the hardcore. He was drawing social distinctions, too. Social distinctions in what way? The upper crust, or was he speaking of the hardcore of the ordinary? The ordinary was my impression. Patterson certainly is. Doesn't have much of a quarrel with any aristocracy, I'm sure. The ordinary fellow. I don't think I asked you this before, but did you ever go to any Greek bars or Greek restaurants? No, I know where they are. So-called Tobinas are all over on Decatur Street or so. Casimo's bar. There are some interesting murals in the Greek Club drawn by an artist known as Kent. His name was Kenneth Reynolds. Did you ever know him? No. Very interesting, the history of the Greek armies in murals. On the walls? Yes, I didn't expect to find it in that kind of place. Well, Barbara and I always thought we'd go to some Greek bars. They used to pipe their music from the phonograph to the outside. You could hear it on the outside. I'm very fond of Greek music. We spoke Greek, but we never did. Neither Barbara nor I speak the Greek language. I don't know what the fuck that means. That is characteristic of Havana, too. There were some wild murals in Las Casas. They were a very amateur kind of Diego Rivera type thing. Folk art having to do with the Aztecs and something's redacted. Blood sacrifices, that sort of thing. They had very wild color. I think through Harold, though, that was this conversation has made me think about a good many things that I haven't thought about in a very long time. I probably will recall things after you are gone. I hope so, and I hope you will make notes of them, Phil. I certainly will. And maybe, since this does serve a purpose, and an imperial purpose, maybe it will keep that little bit of a block down. We may have partly eliminated the block since we've been talking. I hope as it does. It is long since time for the bitterness and the disappointment of those days to have vanished. And externally, I don't feel it. Also, I should hope it has eliminated the twists of one of the things we've talked about, the part I am most interested in is accurate recollection you have of Thornley. Do you remember you have had a very clear recollection that he was not at all unhappy about the assassination? No. That's probably an understatement of the truth. He seemed to be very keyed up about the assassination. He seemed to be very verbally abusive. These things I got from the few letters that he wrote. Kennedy, to my recollection, Kennedy was not mentioned. When I knew Carey in New Orleans, he gave no rational framework to set his antagonism in. In other words, it was simply vitriolic. He really hated him? Well, who can say? I mean, from his words. If you were to take simply his remarks at face value, yes. I found this personally offensive. He did say at this time he was doing a book on Oswald, I think, but he mentioned Oswald and his case in his letters. I believe he mentioned Oswald. I guess he wouldn't have to, because otherwise I wouldn't have known that he was doing a book on Oswald, and I did know that he was supposedly writing one. Then he was supposed to be writing Idle Warriors, whatever it was called, too. That was a book on Oswald, too. Yes, you said it was. He did not mention, not to indicate this to me at the time. Well, after the assassination, he did a book called Oswald. That, I would say, is perhaps 3 or 4 days' work. If any body works, maybe a week. A very slight book. And he may have been referring to that. Can you think of anybody whom he may have had known, may have had a copy of the manuscript, or may have seen either or both? You mean of the people you knew before you left New Orleans, with whom he might have entrusted a copy of the Idle Warriors? The only person that I can think of is Vic Latham. He's the only person that I know of who knew Thornley well enough to say, come over into his home. I was to do a reading at Loyola South. I was over at Latham's. Barbara and I went over there. I wanted a mock audience, and I was to read some work to see how my voice was. I hadn't read for a while, and we went over to Vic's, and Carey went along. and he was quite at home there, and he'd been there before, and they were friends. Aside from that, I can't think of anyone with the possible exception of the girl down at Carlos, the waitress, at Castillo's, whose name I cannot think of. I knew her only in any case very slightly. Brandy worked there briefly. I used to come in for some coffee or to eat lunch, and the girl would be there. She was a pleasant girl. Very pretty, according to Barbara. Yes, quite attractive. Did you ever see any commando types in Castillo's, any men dressed in fatigues? My recollection of people who came to Carlos' place, the food's pretty good, incidentally, if you like Mexican food, were tourists, a lot of tourists, who were obviously not even necessarily Southerners, middle-class people with their families. I think Barbara mentioned to you something that she mentioned to me that I may have garbled in writing it down, but my words are pretty specific. She connected Thornley with over top of restaurant and long-range radio, presumably a transmitter. I took that to be Castillo's. She mentioned something. Do you have any knowledge of any radio transmitter up there? No, I have no knowledge of any of that sort of thing. I was never upstairs. Presumably it did have an upstairs. The building did have a second floor, but I saw no transmitter or receiver anywhere in the quarter that I can recall. I must have garbled it when I wrote it down. Well, she asked me over the phone. Apparently you had discussed it. I certainly noticed in glancing through here that trying to think or see if there was another name or something other thing that would remind me of something. Here, what you are glancing through is your address book. Yes, this is an old address book that still has things in it that I use, but most of this stuff was either written down before I went to New Orleans or was written down while I was there, names of doctors and things I saw, for example, in the quarter. Let's just go ahead if you have questions you want to ask. And then this is at the end of the transcript. Mr. Harold Weisberg. Dear Harold, my replies to your questions on these 3 pages of transcript regarding Carrie Thornley's written remarks to me about President Kennedy and the assassination are not really supported by the texts of Carrie's letters. I reread the letters before sending them along to you and found them much milder in tone on the subject of the president, at least, than I had recalled. There is at least one remark about the president's grave that is in very poor taste, and I was no doubt shocked by it, especially at the time, but all in all, the letters do not seem to support such strong statements as I made when you interviewed me. And from the letters, it also seems likely that Carrie's rather cavalier rejection of my offer, re Song of the White Rose, was what offended me so deeply, what made me decide to stop corresponding with him. Apparently, I was unable to recall this episode clearly or analyze it objectively, and in fact believed that Carrie's remark about the president were what had made me want to break off our correspondence. I am very glad the letters themselves turned up to correct somewhat the rather misleading statements I made during our interview. All right, so I have located these letter correspondence, and so we're not going to cover them today. I just wanted to wrap this up. I think what we're going to do is we're going to start getting into some other stuff. Maybe we'll get into some Vic Latham. Maybe we will dig into some of these handler people. But usually I have a feeling that when I drown you people in fucking one subject for like weeks at a time, like I just did, it's good to take a break and go on to something else. And so I located a slew of documents on Lauren Hall from Harold Weisberg. So I think we might cover that. I don't know. It depends on how I feel when I wake up that fucking day. So that's going to do it for today, guys. Please go out and buy my book. It's at Amazon.com. It's called A Warning from History. And you know the spiel. You can go to buymeacoffee.com and you can give me your money. I would appreciate it if you do so. And that's going to do it. Tune in to Day 0 tomorrow, and I'll be back Monday with some more document goodness. See you guys.